Hey, so welcome everyone to our 18th lecture in the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series. Today we have the pleasure of listening to someone many of us are very familiar with, Associate Professor Angela Roothaan from Vrije Universiteit. I don't know if I got that pronunciation right, um, in Amsterdam. Angela is well known for her contribution to intercultural philosophy. She's done a lot of work in that area, in the study of sort of comparative ontologies, I would say. And more recently, there's been some very interesting publications in the area of environmental ethics, in the area of aesthetics. And yeah, she's very well published in different areas of philosophical traditions, particularly within European philosophy and African philosophy. Some of her recent works include indigenous, modern, and post-colonial relations to nature, negotiating the environment, which was published by Routledge in 2019, Beauty in African Thought, Critical Perspectives on the Western Idea of Development, by Roman and Littlefield in this year, and then Well-being in African Philosophy, Insight for a Global Ethics of Development. So all very excellent research work. So today we are eagerly looking forward to your talk. You'll be speaking on the theme Bantu Ontology and the Ontological Turn, a discussion of the non-relation between anthropological theory and disciplinary philosophy. So we're eagerly looking forward to hearing your talk. Please remain muted so that we can enjoy the lecture. Once the lecture is ended, we'll have opportunities for comments and questions as well. So Angela, you have our attention.
Thank you so much, Elvis, for introducing me and for giving me this opportunity as well. I'm very honored to speak here. So let me start by saying something of what went before and what is the horizon, so to speak, of this talk. Elvis already mentioned my book, Indigenous, Modern, and Post-Colonial Relations to Nature, which came out 4 years ago. In that book, I asked the question, why is there no dialogue between modern Western philosophy and indigenous philosophies? And my conclusion was that, especially when you talk about the environment, which was a topic of the book, there's an actual, what I call, most silent war going on. Every week, several environmental defenders are killed all over the world, and almost half of them are indigenous people who are trying to defend their places where they live, their jungles, their deserts, or whatever. And I thought when you have a war, even if it's a silent one and a war that nobody talks about, there should first be negotiations before a dialogue can start. So that was why the book was called Negotiating the Environment. Now, that is, so to speak, the systematic background of this talk, because I see no really dialogue between indigenous people and their philosophy, from their philosophy and modern Western philosophy, which calls itself universal philosophy. And this plays out, interestingly enough, also in the book Bantu Philosophy by Placide Tempels. This book I read, I think, almost 20 years ago, when I first got interested in African philosophy. And when I read it, I was really struck by a problem, which I thought, how can he do that? How can he solve this? This is a kind of contradiction in the book. Namely, the issue was that Placide Tempels, being a Catholic philosopher and more or less adhering to neo-Thomistic philosophy, had to hold that there's one reality, the reality created by God, brought forth by God. And at the same time, he speaks about different ontologies. European ontology, he calls the one, and the Bantu ontology. And I think most of you know that this is the core topic of the book, or the one most discussed, that this difference between European ontology and Bantu ontology is seen by him as a difference between an ontology which mainly sees the static nature of reality as primary, that is the European one, and that Bantu ontology would see the nature of reality as being dynamic, as being a kind of flux and coming and going in intensity of force. And how can he speak of different ontologies and one reality? And that problem stuck in my head for many years, and I never had real time to solve it, and I didn't have the background. So I started reading up in African philosophy first, and reception of temples, and later came to study the book itself more and more deeply. So that's a bit the background of my talk, so to speak, the horizon of my talk. I will now briefly indicate the kind of chapters of my talk and then go ahead. First, I go into, I will say something about my research into Bantu philosophy, because that clarifies how I read his book. This is part of a bigger project. I call it the Bantu Philosophy Project. It exists for over a few years. Informally, already 5 or 6 years, and more formally, 3 years. And it's a kind of network connecting people who studied this book. So that's the first part of my talk, to go into the background, my research into Bantu philosophy. Then I will move to Bantu ontology, which is, of course, the main topic of this talk, and explain some of the criticisms of that idea of Bantu ontology, especially in relation to what I just said. How can temples accept one reality and different ontologies? After that, I will go to discuss the ontological turn in cultural anthropology, and it indicate that it doesn't discuss Bantu philosophy or Bantu ontology, and ask myself, what does that mean? Why doesn't it read that book as a kind of precursor? Then I will go into the question, the main question of the talk. Why do anthropologists and philosophers alike ignore this work, and why don't we discuss with each other about culturalizing ontologies? And then I come to the final part, how to repair this non-relation or this non-discussion between anthropology and philosophy. And I mean, well, in this case, disciplinary philosophy, so academic philosophy, and anthropological theory especially. So not, of course, the big body of more empirical work in anthropology. Now, then let me first go into some of the important aspects of my research in Bantu philosophy. I think this book, which has been much discussed among African philosophers especially, but also some of the post-colonial thinkers like Césaire and Fanon, that this book has not been really understood. That is my view. I was really interested and a bit baffled when I started reading the critiques of Bantu philosophy a long time ago, because many of the standing critiques seemed a bit off. And it took me a long time to find out that this was partly due to the fact that the book has been read in translations. So I won't go into the whole translation history of the book because that is very complex and very difficult to understand. But the main point is that Tempels was a Flemish Belgian missionary working in the Belgian colony of Congo, and he wrote and thought in Flemish Dutch. As a Dutch reader, I of course read the Dutch version first, and later I only started reading the English and the French versions. And I was triggered by some remarks by other Dutch readers of the book that said, there's something wrong with these translations, very wrong. They seem much more racist and colonial in tone than the original. So from that point on, I thought it is important to go into the whole translation business. And recently, I published, that was not mentioned by Elvis, understandably, because it's in Dutch. I published a new Dutch retranslation of the original work, meaning only freshening up the older language from 1945, which also has a bit dated Flemish vocabulary into present-day Dutch. And now I'm working on a new English translation of the book from the Dutch version. And in this whole research, I'm working towards understanding more the context of the work, the context of his life. And I find this in reactions that took place in his lifetime and also in archival work. Now, I cannot go into the whole reception history, of course, and others have written about it. For instance, Mudimbe, Valentin Mudimbe, in his book Invention of Africa, but also Pius Mosima, who is also working in the Bantu Philosophy project in his book on philosophic sagacity. And I will just pick one example of a kind of very harsh critique of Tempels to show you a bit what is going on. And that is in the book by Cyril Berhan, The Hermeneutics of African Philosophy. And in that book, he speaks of Senghor and Tempels as ontologizing colonial European projections of Africa. And you may not know, but Leopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal and a poet and philosopher himself, was an admirer of Bantu philosophy. And Cyril Berhan also speaks of, quote, the colonialist ontologizing of Father Placide Tempels, which is, of course, a kind of harsh critique. He follows Huntonji there. Pauline Huntonji was also very critical of Bantu philosophy and rejects Senghor and Tempels, and also others like Alexis Kagame and John Beatty, who were favorable of Bantu philosophy. And he said that they were, quote, avoiding the political questions of the anti-colonial struggle, unquote. Cyril Berhan quotes Tempels then as saying, and that quote would prove that he was really a colonialist, so to speak. Of course, he worked in the colonial system, but he quotes him as saying, our civilizing mission alone can justify our occupation of the land of uncivilized peoples, unquote. And he stresses there, of course, the correlation between occupation and civilizing mission. Now, when we look into the text, it says something quite different. And this is in the quite bad English translation, but it's as it follows the Dutch here. It says there, it has been said that our civilizing mission alone can justify our occupation of the land of uncivilized peoples. So Tempels doesn't say that himself, but he quotes others. He refers to others who have said that the civilizing mission is justification of colonialism. And Tempels goes on then to critique that position of these others, because he's of the opinion that this civilizing mission, as it is carried out, is wrongly directed, because it forgets that the Bantu already have their own philosophy and their own understanding of the world. Of course, there is a problem with what I'm saying now, because in Bantu philosophy, Tempels himself uses the word civilizing. He speaks of civilizing Africans, civilizing our civilizing mission, etc. Although he critiques the standing interpretation of them. But I found in my research an interesting source who showed that Tempels' use of that word was rejected by him later in life. And that was a book by Philippa Schuler, I don't know how to pronounce it. She was an African-American concert pianist, very famous as a child prodigy. And when she was a young adult, she started touring South America and also Africa. And she was so famous in her days that she was invited to play at festivities of Congo's independence. She was, because she was considered a top pianist, she met many presidents, prime ministers, independence leaders, and she was also very Catholic and very interested in what the missionaries did in Africa. So she wrote an entire book also on the work of missionaries in Africa. And in that project, she visited Tempels and interviewed him extensively. In another book of her about the history of Congo in that time of independence, that was published in 1962, that book was called Who Killed the Congo? She quotes Tempels and says that he expressed to her, quote, "I never use the word convert. It implies an attitude of superiority. Nor do I ever use the phrase to civilize, for that implies condescension." So that must have been around 1960 that Temple said it to her. So you see that in 1945, when the Belgian colony was still in full motion, so to speak, nobody of the Belgians thought that it would be over soon. Well, some maybe did, but most of the people thought that the colony would remain in existence for at least 30 or 40 years. So in that time, Tempels must have struggled to bring his ideas across in a world that was convinced that Europeans were superior. But around 1960, he had more space, so to say, to express his thoughts in a more critical manner. And of course, again, archival research shows not that Tempels was in any way supporting revolutionary activity. That was not his calling. So there, Cirque Berhan and others are right. He's not supporting the struggle or something. But he saw as his calling to learn from the Africans that he lived with. So his mission was to learn and not so much to be politically active. So my aim is not to defend Tempels against any criticisms. I see him as the ambiguous person that he was. As a missionary, philosopher, an anthropologist, critical of Europe, but also convinced that Europeans could, in a dialogue, also bring some new and important things to Africa, but also to learn from Africa as well. So I also think, what I think about the many criticisms of Tempels, I think criticism is, of course, at the heart of any true scholarly research, but it is important to further criticism in a scholarly way. And often Tempels has been used just on the basis of a few quotes, and as you saw in Sir Berhan as misguided quotes, we should dig up sources. We should really critically study these translations and open up the hermeneutical horizon against which we can see Bantu philosophy. So let me leave the issue of the translations here. I could say more about that, but I had as an example that, well, let me just mention it, one thing, just as an example, but every page of these translations holds strange things. In the Colin King translation, which is the 1959 English translation of Bantu philosophy, which was again based on the 1949 French translation, there's a page in chapter 2, which is on the epistemology, so to speak, of the Bantu. There are 3 sentences where Tempels explicitly places African stage philosophy and academic Western philosophy next to each other and explains why they are the same activity. And these 3 sentences are removed in the translation. So that is very weird. So the Tempels stressing that African thought and European thought is equal and in importance and weight are just removed from the translation. And let me read one of those sentences because then you get the feeling of what Tempels wrote in 1945. It says, the insight, and now I give my own translation from the Dutch, of course, because it is not present in the English translation. The insight of indigenous people in the nature of things, as well as the distinctions of learned professionals, are both intellectual knowledge of essential being, and they do not differ from each other as knowledge. Both are metaphysics, and the thought system that is built on a certain concept of essential being is philosophy. So that seems to me clear enough about his intention. Now, that about my research into Bantu philosophy, a bit about the translations and the reception. And now I want to go into the topic of Bantu ontology. And for those who are just coming into the lecture, let me repeat that the main issue that I always have seen in Bantu philosophy has been this idea that there's one reality, but different ontologies, European ontology and Bantu ontology. Now, what beyond textual and post-colonial criticism does Bantu ontology do as philosophy? I also referred already to the fact that this European ontology, in his view, was mainly focused on being aesthetic, say Parmenides, and that the Bantu ontology saw reality as dynamic. Now, another thing when you study the context of the work is that there were first critiques before the book was published. And these first critiques are rarely known because the book was first published as articles in Dutch colonial, say, ethnographic journals, which were published in Congo. They are called Band and Equatoria. 2 fellow missionaries who were also anthropologists, Edmond Boulaert and Gustav Hulstaert, also Belgians, of course, who founded this journal Equatoria. They both reacted also to Bantu philosophy in a critical manner. And I want to quote something from a review written by Boulaert, Edmond Boulaert, which he wrote in 1947 or 46, that's not completely clear, where he critiques this opposition by Tempels between static ontology as European and dynamic ontology as African. This is often given in the quote, "Being is force, force is being." Now, Boulard quotes a Monsieur Clare, a bishop and also missionary, who was the apostolic vicar in the region of Kivu in Congo. And this Mr. Clare wrote, quote, "The nature of a being is that being as principium operationis," with Latin, the principle of effect or agency. The quote goes on, "For the whole of the Philosophia Perennis, the eternal philosophy, the principle applies ens et actus convertuntur, esse et agere convertuntur." So being and action are convertible in each other. And the quote goes on, "For us, as well as for the Bantu," Clare writes, "force is inseparably connected with being as such." So he doesn't see any difference between Bantu ontology and European ontology. Tempels, of course, was irritated with this because he thought very, very important what he wanted to bring about across. And he wrote in a letter, which I found in the archive, to his long-standing friend Emile Pousseau, who was a magistrate who studied law in Congo. And Pousseau, his friend Pousseau, actually pushed him to write Bantu philosophy. And after they met at a certain point in their lives, they kept on sending letters to each other for the rest of their lives, always on philosophy, the colony, how people thought about his book, etc. Now, in this letter, which is from June 1946, Tempels reacts to these critiques. He said to his friends, "I'm surprised that my pages of Bantu philosophy on ontology are not understood, because he thinks they are very clear." And he writes, quote, "We have a conception of essential being," with we he means Europeans. "We have a conception of essential being. They have too. We both have a concept of ens, being. The ens is that what is for us. But that same ens, that same reality is for them already in its existing, in its nature, in its essence, force." And he adds, "Like you said," addressing himself to his friend, "life is of variable intensity." That's interesting, because from talking about being, which his critiquer wrote about, he moves on to life. So they were also obviously discussing life as that's the nature of that dynamic ontology. The quote goes on, and Tempels also writes, "The ens in general, the final reality that is common to all ensia, all beings, is already understood as dynamic, as force or principle of action." He stresses further that his, so now the quote is ended, Tempels stresses further that his critics still see force as accidental to being in some way, but he doesn't completely get out of the conceptual difficulties of proving this. Now, when I read all of this, my point would be the reason of Tempels not succeeding in convincing his readers of his view lies not so much in his insufficient philosophical training, as some have said, that he was a priest and only studied philosophy for 2 years, but in his doing something that was not done before, trying to transform philosophy as universal, single logical system, and we know now accidentally that was construed as Greco-European by Kant and Hegel and Hume, etc., to philosophy as plural and still logical, still expressing the nature of being, still expressing truth. So philosophy is plural and still logical. That is what he tries to do. Now, let me now move to something about the ontological turn in anthropology. This is about 20 years ago that anthropologists, theoretical anthropologists who also did empirical work, some of them, like for instance Eduardo Kohn and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who both worked in South America, and others who worked in Mongolia and other places of the world, tried to ascribe philosophical quality, logic and reason to what was still considered mostly as mythological thought, as primitive thought or wild thought, etc., meaning indigenous understanding of the world. So these ontological turn anthropologists try to ascribe logic and reason to this indigenous understanding. But still, they use Western philosophers to prove their point. Like Eduardo Kohn uses the American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce and his sign theory to describe what the people he studied in the Amazon actually were doing. And Eduardo Viveros de Castro uses Deleuze's postmodern philosophy to make clear what indigenous people in the Amazon were thinking. So there is still no direct listening to indigenous thinkers themselves. Also, they don't refer to philosophers who try to think pluralism ontologically, as mainly, and now I talk about it, those known to me, William James, another pragmatist, of course, who wrote this book, A Pluralistic Universe, and Placide Tempels, who tried to do pluralist ontology in his book, Bantu Philosophy. Now, let me go back to Bantu Philosophy again from this viewpoint. What is seldomly noted is the structure of the book, because many people just get this vital force out of it and two types of ontology, and then they're done. But in fact, the book has a whole built-up argumentation. The first and the last chapters are mainly to address European readers, why they should read this, and why they should be critical of their own worldview. And the book begins with two chapters discussing ontology and epistemology, and then follows with three chapters, which he sees as giving empirical explanation that show how Bantu ontology works in the actual knowledge systems of Bantu people, in their moral theory, their legal theory, their healing ideas, their physics, etc. Now, these chapters not only explain and confirm the Bantu ontology, they also clarify the very Bantu ontology. And they are often overlooked, so I think people should read them more precisely. And what you see when you study those chapters more intensely is that the concepts that Tempels work with seem to fall short. Force and being hardly express the continuous ebb and flow, the web of energy that Tempels understands to be present in the Bantu conception of reality as life. Now think back of his remark to his friend Emile Bousseau, where he wrote, like you said, life is of variable intensity. So he wants to express how being is understood as life. He once uses the image of a spider's web where everything is connected, but not connected by a physical thread, but by threads of energy, I would almost say, yeah, which is then pressed artificially in these philosophical concepts of force and being. But these concepts fall short, I think, of what Tempels wants to say. Now, let me go to my more closing parts. Why do anthropologists and philosophers alike ignore this work? Not only, I think, by coincidence, as it was a bit forgotten because it was Catholic and missionary and colonial. Like, for instance, James' work, A Pluralistic Universe, is also hardly read or studied in philosophy programs. So mostly professional philosophy, I think, keeps to the single universal logical system that happens to be European in origin in their view. And anthropologists seem not ready to express indigenous ontology on its own terms without help of like pragmatic sign theory or French postmodernism. So a fundamental translation issue is still before us, to work towards understanding both indigenous philosophy and Western, quote unquote, academic philosophy as doing the same. As Tempels said, and I read that quote before to you, where he said, we have a conception of essential being, they have to, we both have a concept, etc. So this indigenous philosophy is, we're still, or anthropology or philosophy is still tempted to always see it as mythology and not reason, as intuitive knowledge versus argumentative knowledge, etc. Now, how can we repair this? That is my final part. Let me refer to a concept by Lewis Gordon, who said academic philosophy is suffering from disciplinary decadence. When you keep to the strict demarcation of the field of philosophy with its own methodological principles and all that belongs to that, that is very safe and it keeps the other, the oppressed, the rejected, the muted, etc., out. To think the difficult issues of our times from a shared humanity, we should first have to start to think interdisciplinary. Let the study of culture and the study of logical thought influence each other. So anthropological theory and disciplinary philosophy should meet. And this is what Tempels attempted, and I think why his work was not understood. Only one, to my knowledge, African philosopher really touched upon this issue, and that was Valentin Mudimbe in his The Invention of Africa. He gave there a critical overview of attempts to think what is Africa or what is African, whereas he was well aware that the very concepts are historical constructions, serving the goals of worldly powers in different ways through time. Mudimbe doesn't accept the simple rejection of ethno-philosophy, as it was called by Huntonji. And ethno-philosophers, according to Huntonji, were not only Tempels, but also Kagame and Senghor and Biti, for instance. Ethno-philosophy was simply rejected as not serving the anti-colonial struggle. Mudimbe tries to read Bantu philosophy and the other ethno-philosophers critically. And he remarks, quote, Bantu ontology could be a guide to all non-Western ontologies, unquote. After that, the summarizing of some standing reactions to Bantu philosophy, among others, Okot Bitex and Biti's, Mudimbe stresses how Tempels declares, and I quote again from Mudimbe, the present study, after all, claims to be no more than a hypothesis, a first attempt at the systematic development of what Bantu philosophy is. He then again stresses the ambiguity of Tempels' works. Is it conservative, praising a traditional past, locking Africans in that past, as is often said? Or is it, as Alioune Diop said, opening holes in the wall of colonial ideology? Mudimbe then says maybe the value of the work exactly lies in this tension. He thinks it can be a source for a critical philosophy. Critical philosophy being that human reflection that is ready, always hypothetically, to distinguish elements of truth from elements of untruth. Tempels was ready to critique the professional, Thomistic philosophy of his time and to anthropology, which he considered to be merely descriptive and othering, because there was an absence of dialogue between efforts. And he was ready to critique the non-conversation between them, between philosophy and anthropology. This non-conversation is still heard as a loud silence today. But now, a positive note to end. I see many attempts from all sides by young scholars. I get emails from them who try to mend it and negotiate for a dialogical thinking that dares to ask for truth from a shared humanity. And there's where I want to end my lecture. And I hope to get some nice feedback and questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thanks a lot. That was really excellent. A lot of food for thought. We'll open it now for questions and comments, and perhaps I will begin. I think, yeah, as you said, the fundamental question is always sort of revolves around language and translation. Yeah. When a text goes through series of translations, there is always a tendency for erasure of meaning or loss of meaning in the process. But two things then: who takes the responsibility for the loss of meaning? For example, the sentence, the three sentences that got missing along the line in the translations of Tempels' work from Dutch to French, from French to English, and so on and so forth. Is it deliberate or non-deliberate? Who takes the responsibility for sort of mutilating the meaning, that the original meaning? And what sort of ethical commitments is needed to ensure that translations carry the original meaning? Because I don't speak Dutch, I don't speak Bantu, and I want to learn about what Tempels has said, then I will obviously be relying on an English translation. How do we ensure that such a translation that provides some sort of epistemic access sticks to the original meaning? And I know it's a lot of questioning, so-called one question, but yeah, your comments will be helpful. And if you have any question, please just use your digital hand or put it in the chat box. So.
Yes, thank you. That's a very, very good question. Yeah. Who takes responsibility for the translations and the mistranslations? Well, in a practical sense, I hope to produce a new English translation, which is at least a bit more true to the Dutch original. Well, I hope to do it in the next year, teaching and other things allowing. But of course, also that translation will not be the final one. Every translation is a translation for its time. And I think when you wonder as a Dutch reader, why did they do this? Why do they mutilate the text like this? The only reason I could come up with is that the first reactions from these Catholic missionaries in his time were sometimes very intense. They were all kind of fearing for their own work, their own life. What if we as missionaries are seen as too radical? Will we still be able to do our work? Will the church, Rome, so to speak, as they were Catholics, will it interfere with our work, etc.? Tempels is showing from the letters that he was often quite afraid of getting an interdiction from Rome of publishing his work. And from that kind of murmur around the book, maybe the translation was already kind of adapting to a more colonial mindset, a more conservative mindset, to not raise further problems. And from the letters with his friend Bousseau, he discusses this whole translation issue for like 10 or 15 years with his friend. And Pousseau actually, well, now go a bit more into the publication history, started to translate because he was a full bilingual French, Dutch, Belgian. He started translating into French while the articles were coming out. And he also wrote a foreword. And then when Présence Africaine, which was founded, of course, by Alioune Diop and Cédar Senghor, they wanted to publish it then. They found this translation not clear enough and too radical. So they hired someone else to make a more acceptable one. So that was the translation for that time, so to speak. I think now we need a translation for a completely other time in which the work, and that is my view, of course, in which the work should mainly be taken seriously as a philosophy work and not as a work in the decolonization struggle or something like that.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Angela. I saw Professor Yeshile's hand at a point, but I think he might have dropped out. Yeah, please go ahead, Rich.
Thank you, Angela, for a really interesting and insightful talk. I wanted to make a comment which you might, I'd like to hear more of you speaking about this, and then I'm going to ask a question. I'm interested in the way in which the classification of philosophical ideas as ontology has political consequences. What I mean by that is that, as you highlighted, that in the debates between the construction of what's often called ethno-philosophy and philosophy, meaning, quote, proper philosophy, academic philosophy, and so on, there was often this idea that traditions, indigenous traditions, such as Bantu, that engaged in ontology, that this was really about a kind of pre-modern, pre-scientific, superstitious or religious worldview, and it was a way to exclude them from engagement. And I've seen some scholars try to obviate this problem by focusing on epistemology, for instance, and saying that, you know, if we look at epistemological questions, then we can kind of bring them in. But then, as you highlighted very well, with the kind of ontological turn, particularly in anthropology, ontology is no longer a kind of, quote, dirty word, and it's a kind of recognition of taking, I guess, what we would call diverse life worlds seriously. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But my real question is, I'm intrigued by the idea about what this means, that philosophy is plural, but still logical. And what do you see in Tempels and perhaps other writers, you mentioned William James as well, as the kind of claim, the basis for being able to make that kind of turn in relation to philosophy?
Yes, thank you. But it's a complex feedback. So let me just pick out something which I think I can answer about the plurality of philosophy. Well, of course, the main problem maybe is that philosophy was or is sometimes seen as singular, and that a logic is singular. And why would there not be different systems of logic? As when we build software, we have different tools or different methodologies to do so. So why would we not have different types of logic in understanding the world or reality? And of course, nowadays we see especially among philosophers, for instance, from the conversational school. I saw Jonathan Chimakonam was also in this lecture series one time, or in another series. He has written this book, Isomesu Logic, building a different type of African logic from another African language, not the Luba language, which Tempels, of course, was referring to. And I think that is a serious work, and it is serious. I think it makes sense. And well, I think William James did more or did better than Temples to discuss how this would be possible. So James went more into the problems of the whole matter. He had read Immanuel Kant a lot, and his single definition of what is rational, etc., and what is logical, and othering the rest. So he was always in this kind of discussion with Kant, and he has this idea of a pluralistic universe where he says it's not a block universe. We cannot understand reality as one single block, which we can define and then close in, and we are in there, and it's easy. So we just try a system out, a theory out, and then maybe it doesn't fit completely. We repair it, we build another one, etc. And he uses this nice sentence where he says, and always an and, A and D trails along. So there's always a kind of comma. So we're never done with understanding reality. And that makes sense to me. And from that perspective, it's also not so important to criticize Tempels, for instance, by saying that, oh yes, but also European is not always static. We also have Heraclitus or Bergson or whatever. So that's not so important, because that is only important when you want to keep African and European philosophy apart. But when you think from dialogue, which Tempels try to do, then of course we can, through translation and all its problems, we can understand each other, and we can dialogue with each other about what is dynamic and what is static, and etc. So that will be my answer.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Angela.
Yeah, interesting. Professor, usually, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me too?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I was put off by the data, the network. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, clearly.
Yes, I want to thank Angela for this talk, and Elphys too. I've gained quite a lot from the discussion, and certain points come up. One, we should respect whatever worldview is presented from different cultures. And we now discovered that philosophy has transcended a strictly individual enterprise. In fact, some days ago, Ingrid Robbins of Utrecht University was trying to talk about team philosophy. And I commented that, look, all those things labeled as ethnophilosophy some years ago as just being on critical worldview are now resonating again, because to fashion out a philosophy, given the complexity of the world now, you need to listen to every participant in the context for survival. And so Temples has done a very good work. At least the errors or the shortcomings in terms of translation and lack of too much painstakingness can be excused, because it was a pioneering work. And I encourage I admire the courage of Angela for bringing up Temples over and over again, because it is the foundation of the African philosophical enterprise. And so from that time onwards, when Tempels wrote that work, a lot of improvement has resulted, and it has drawn our attention to the fact that worldviews matter, no matter how we look at it. Worldviews matter. And then when we take it from that perspective, we discover that all those pioneering works, even as they were criticized by the those we call the African philosophers of the scientific bent of mind, Otonji, Bodorin, Wiredu, and so on and so forth, they have discovered that we need content. And without works that will label ethnophilosophy and so on and so forth, African philosophy will lack that desired content. So I see our going back to Tempels as something very instructive. And I want to encourage us, like Sophie Oluwole did recently, before our demise, try to consider, and compare two patron saints, Socrates and Orunmila. And it really tells you about the culture of others. And I want to round up by saying that in contemporary world, attention must be given to other perspective, no matter how we think they are crude, no matter how crude they are, because you have to start from something. And that's something somebody like Tempels has provided for us. So I want to thank Angela for this talk, and I'm seeing her for the first time in many years again.
Yes.
Since I left Netherlands, she hosted me to a wonderful reception. I went around to see so many things. So I really admire your courage. Thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you for your comment, Professor Ishile. We have a question in the chat, Angela.
Can I also react maybe to the feedback?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Professor Oyashili, for this support. This is very important, and thank you for expressing it and relating it, the ethnophilosophy as communal philosophy to team philosophy, as brought up by my colleague Ingrid Robijns from Utrecht. I wanted to add to this something which came to my mind, because for me it has always been not only about understanding the other, but also about understanding yourself. Because in a way, colonial thought, so to speak, not only colonizes outward, but also colonizes inward. In earlier publications, I have shown that the same Immanuel Kant, who excluded Africans from logical reasoning, also wrote a book which not many people have read, where he bans all, so to speak, European indigenous knowledge, like spiritual knowledge, traditional healing knowledge, etc., as not based on science. So we are also, so to speak, indigenous. We also have ancient, what I know, Germanic peoples in ourselves, or Celtic peoples, or whatever. And my personal interest, and I will always bring this out, because it's important to also show your personal roots in a discussion, is that I've been raised first by family members, among whom there were several older women, who taught me to listen to animals and to respect trees and nature, etc. And maybe even talk to deceased family members when you were in trouble. And then I went to school, and I went to church, and I got my church education and my school education. And all of this was never there. So even as a child, I already felt that there was this kind of epistemic problem. So this is my personal route of searching the whole field. So maybe someone can relate to that. Thank you.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, because even the very concept of Western philosophy, European philosophy, is very reductionist, it says.
Yeah.
There's a lot excluded in that process as well. Yeah. We had a question in the chat from Vanessa that says, thank you so much for the clear presentation, dear Professor Roothaan. just a short question. Could you say a few words on the role of ancestors in Bantu ontology? I think referring here to what Tempest wrote about it in text. Do you see similar discrepancies regarding the translation?
Thank you. Yes. Actually, in my English translation work, I've not yet come to the part where he discusses the ancestors. So I have no actual examples about that. But I can say something about the role of ancestors in Bantu ontology, as Tempels describes it, of course. And there are overlaps in his treatment of the matter and that of John Beattie in his African Religions and Philosophy. That the more influential in a spiritual and material sense you have been in your life, the more ancestral power, so to speak, remains from your life after you deceased. So an ancestor is someone who has left a heritage behind, but a heritage that still works. And in that sense, also pragmatic philosophy is helpful to understand how this dynamic ontology works. So when you completely think of a human being as a thing, kind of finite thing, which is held within a skin and held within a brain, and when the body dies, it is done with that individual, then thinking about living on as an ancestor is problematic. But when you think of your life not so much as a body, but as a process in which you receive energy of your elders, so to speak, and of your peers, and also pass on energy to others, then of course it makes sense to think that you still persist when you're gone, because what you have given to others who are still living persists. So in that sense, I would understand the whole idea of ancestor, and I think this is also true to how I say it is true to what Beattie and Tempels want to say. So is this an answer? I hope it is.
Thanks a lot, Angela. Yeah, I think I'm satisfied. So thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. It's been very interesting talk. I'm sure many of us will watch it again and refer to it. And of course, thank you all for your questions and for being here. This will be available in a short time, perhaps in the next week or two, on the center's YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch it and share it with friends and colleagues as well. Our next talk would be on Friday, 24th of November, where we'll be having Professor Samantha Weiss at the University of Witwatersrand, speaking on the theme self-respect, integrity, and a racially imperfect world. And so we look forward to that as well. So do enjoy the weekend. And once again, thank you so much, Angela, for being here. And I hope we will keep in touch, definitely.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thank you so much for hosting
Thank you,
me,
Angela.
and for all the interesting feedback and questions. And I see some other friends I met in real life. So happy to see you all again. And I hope you're all, we'll be well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Looking forward to your translation, actually. Yeah.
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 Good, thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye everyone. Take care.